Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. The screen fades in from black. Dust swirling, sun beating down on a dirt road, two men facing off in silence as a tumbleweed rolls between them. In the background, saloon doors creak open, revealing smoky rooms filled with poker games, whiskey, and piano tunes slightly out of tune. A pistol glints in the sunlight. Tension crackles in the air. The voiceover cuts in, low and dramatic. You've seen it in movies. The classic gunslinger showdown at high noon. The lawless frontier where outlaws ruled, sheriffs were lone heroes, and every saloon had a secret. But how much of it was real? The montage picks up speed. Train robberies, horseback chases, wanted posters nailed to dusty walls, and daring escapes across desolate plains. Then, the imagery shifts. Black and white photos of real settlers, Native Americans pushed from their lands, women in prairie dresses, Chinese railroad workers, and newly freed Black Americans heading west in search of new beginnings. The tone darkens and deepens. Behind the legend was a far more complex, often brutal reality, one shaped not just by duels and desperados, but by displacement, racism, opportunity, and survival. Suddenly, the screen cuts to a close-up of a vintage revolver being loaded. A match strikes, a train bell rings, then silence. The voiceover returns, sharper now, more urgent. Was the Wild West really lawless? Who got rich? And who paid the price? And why do we still cling to these myths today? A final fast-cut montage flashes across the screen. A gunfight in the street dissolves into a court ledger showing land theft. A saloon scene fades into an image of a Black family homesteading. In Oklahoma, a cowboy riding into the sunset is overlaid with news headlines from the time. Real stories, not legends. Then, in a beat of silence, the voiceover closes the cold open. This is the true story of the American West. Grittier, more diverse, and more revealing than Hollywood ever dared to show. The screen cuts to black, with just the faint sound of wind over open plains. The title card appears, The Real Wild West, Myths, Truths, and the Untold Stories That Shaped America. As the screen fades in from the cinematic cold open, the tone shifts slightly, more grounded, inviting. A soft Western-style guitar plays. In the background, as archival photos and old map overlays roll across the screen, the narrator's voice returns, this time more relaxed but still confident and engaging. Welcome to History Revealed, the place where the legends of the past are peeled back to uncover the real stories underneath. If you're new here, we dig deep into the moments, people, and movements that shaped history, going beyond the textbook versions to bring you the untold, the misunderstood, and the often overlooked truths. Clips play of past episodes, Civil War, ancient civilizations, forgotten empires, offering a visual sampler of the channel's depth. If you love diving into the gritty reality behind the myths, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you don't miss any of our deep dives. The tone picks back up with dramatic flair as imagery of cowboys, Native Americans, wagon trains, and frontier towns starts to layer the screen. In this episode, we're setting our sights on the American Wild West, but not the version you've seen in spaghetti westerns or Hollywood blockbusters. We'll uncover where those famous tropes actually came from, and what the real day-to-day life on the frontier looked like. We'll explore who truly settled the West. And spoiler alert, it wasn't just white cowboys with six-shooters. We'll dig into the overlooked roles of Black cowboys, Native resistance, Chinese railroad laborers, and women who broke every mold. And we'll follow the rise and fall of infamous outlaws, lawmen, and the powerful railroad empires that changed everything. A final wide shot of the vast American plains appears, slowly zooming out as the voiceover continues. This isn't just a story of adventure, it's a story of struggle, survival, invention, and reinvention. So saddle up, we're headed deep into the myth and reality of the American frontier. As the Civil War came to a bloody end in 1865, the eyes of a fractured nation turned westward. For millions of Americans, disillusioned soldiers, newly freed slaves, immigrants, and displaced Native peoples, the vast untamed frontier represented both danger and possibility. From 1865 to 1895, a wave of migration surged beyond the Mississippi. The federal government, eager to populate these lands, offered homesteads and rail connections. But what took shape wasn't just a physical expansion, it was a cultural one too. This was the birth of the Wild West myth, a blend of fact and fantasy carefully crafted to serve a restless public hungry for heroes, villains, and simple answers in a rapidly changing world. In the growing cities of the East, readers devoured cheap dime novels filled with over-the-top tales of gunfights, stagecoach heists, and savage frontier justice. These stories rarely resembled reality, but that was the point. They weren't meant to inform. They were meant to entertain, to sell a vision of rugged individualism and lawless freedom. Writers like Ned Buntline turned men like Buffalo Bill Cody into living legends before they ever stepped onto a battlefield, or into a shootout. Buffalo Bill himself quickly capitalized on the fantasy, launching his Wild West show, a traveling spectacle that mixed rodeo stunts with theatrical reenactments of Indian battles and frontier life. The show toured across America and Europe, further embedding the myth into popular culture. People from London to New York believed they were witnessing the real West, even though what they saw was a scripted performance carefully staged for maximum drama. Newspapers joined the frenzy, reporting on every outlaw raid and frontier clash, with breathless urgency. Exaggeration wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. The more dramatic the tale, the more papers sold. And in a nation still reeling from civil war, many found comfort in the simpler narrative of a wild land tamed by brave men. But the truth was far more complex. The West wasn't just gunslingers and gold miners, it was also the site of genocide, forced relocations, and the slow, grinding force of industrial expansion. The myth obscured as much as it revealed, crafting a version of history that erased the roles of Native Americans, Black settlers, Mexican vaqueros, Chinese laborers, and women of all backgrounds. It replaced reality with romance. The myth of the Wild West didn't emerge naturally. It was manufactured. It was marketed. And it stuck. Even today, echoes of it remain in everything from Western films to cowboy fashion. But to understand the real American West, we have to look past the showmanship and face the truths those stories were meant to distract us from. When we think of the Wild West, it's often the names of outlaws and gunslingers that come first. Billy, the Kid, Jesse James, Doc Holliday. These men have become iconic, elevated into American folklore as larger-than-life anti-heroes. But how much of their reputations were earned, and how much was pure invention? Take Billy the Kid, for example. Born Henry McCarty, he was orphaned young and turned to petty theft before becoming involved in the violent Lincoln County War in New Mexico. Most historians agree he killed between 4 and 8 men, hardly the body count of a legendary killer, especially when compared to the way he's portrayed in films and books as a trigger-happy renegade. Billy wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a drifting youth caught up in local feuds and cycles of revenge. Yet the newspapers of his time turned him into a terrifying outlaw, the boy bandit king, and the legend grew. Then there's Jesse James, often romanticized as a rebel, Robin Hood figure, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. But in reality, Jesse and his brother Frank were Confederate guerrillas turned bank robbers, using violence to push a political agenda. Their gang was responsible for multiple robberies and killings, but they also carefully cultivated their public image, writing letters to the press, posing for portraits, and stoking the fires of their own mythos. To many Southerners bitter over the Civil War, Jesse James wasn't a criminal. He was a folk hero fighting back against Northern authority. Doc Holliday, immortalized by Val Kilmer in Tombstone, was a dentist-turned-gambler who suffered from tuberculosis and often lived on the fringes of society. While he was indeed involved in the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral, the actual events were far less romantic than the dramatized versions. The shootout lasted less than 30 seconds, and most gunfights in the West weren't epic duels. They were spontaneous, clumsy, and often ended with bystanders caught in the crossfire. Many times, violence was avoided altogether because the consequences were simply too high. Despite the popular image of a lawless, trigger-happy frontier, actual records tell a different story. Crime rates in many Western towns were surprisingly low. Tombstone, Dodge City, and Deadwood had their share of trouble, but they also had mayors, city ordinances, and law enforcement, sometimes corrupt or ineffective, but present nonetheless. Many so-called wild towns had stricter gun laws than American cities do today, requiring visitors to check their firearms upon entering. The Hollywood image of the Wild West, with its endless gunfights and stoic sharpshooters, is built more on spectacle than substance. The real West was far messier. Most people, settlers, cowboys, native tribes, and townsfolk, were trying to survive, not looking for duels at dawn. Violence did happen, but it was rarely glorious. The myth of the gunslinger gave the nation a dramatic, digestible version of frontier justice. But in truth, most outlaws weren't charming rogues. They were desperate men in a desperate time, doing what they thought they had to do to survive. Understanding that distinction helps us separate the men from the myths, and brings us one step closer to understanding what life in the West was actually like. The image of the lone sheriff standing tall against a town full of outlaws is one of the most enduring symbols of the Wild West. With a badge pinned to his chest and a revolver on his hip, he's portrayed as the last line of order in a chaotic world, fearless, incorruptible, and always ready to duel evil at high noon. But like most Western myths, this image is more fantasy than fact. In reality, law enforcement in the American frontier was far less glamorous and far more chaotic. Many frontier towns sprang up almost overnight due to mining booms, cattle drives, or railroad expansions, and most lacked any formal system of justice. Sheriffs and marshals were often elected by popular vote, chosen more for their local connections than for their experience. Salaries were low, resources were scarce, and the job was dangerous. Some lawmen were genuinely committed to keeping the peace, but many were just as rough around the edges as the outlaws they were supposed to control. Corruption was rampant. In many cases, sheriffs and town officials were on the payroll of saloon owners, gamblers, or criminal enterprises. With no standardized training and little oversight, lawmen had enormous discretion, which often led to abuse of power. In some towns, there wasn't any official law enforcement at all. Residents were left to fend for themselves. That's where vigilante justice came in. When crimes went unpunished or courts were too slow, communities sometimes formed vigilance committees to handle things themselves. These groups acted outside the law, delivering swift, sometimes brutal, punishment. While some saw it as necessary frontier justice, others used it to settle personal grudges or enforce racial hierarchies. Lynchings, mob executions, and public hangings were not uncommon. Justice on the frontier was often more about who held power than what was fair. Wyatt Earp is a perfect case study in the blurred lines between legend and reality. Popularly remembered as the fearless lawman of Dodge City and the hero of the gunfight at the OK Corral, Earp has been immortalized in dozens of movies and books. But the real Wyatt Earp was far more complex. Before becoming a lawman, he was arrested multiple times for horse theft, assault, and running brothels. He drifted from town to town, often living on the margins of the law, and spent as much time gambling as he did enforcing order. The famous shootout at the OK Corral, often portrayed as a righteous showdown between good and evil, was really the result of a long-standing feud between two factions in Tombstone. It lasted only 30 seconds and left 3 men dead. Earp and his brothers were later tried for murder, but acquitted, largely because they had public support and were seen as heroes despite the questionable legality of their actions. Over time, Wyatt Earp worked hard to shape his own legend. In his later years, he partnered with journalists and screenwriters to tell his version of events, downplaying his flaws and elevating his exploits. By the time Hollywood got hold of his story, the transformation was complete. He had gone from a drifting gambler to the ultimate symbol of frontier justice. But understanding the real story doesn't diminish the drama, it deepens it. It shows us that justice in the Wild West wasn't delivered by mythical heroes with perfect aim and moral clarity. It was forged in the messy, violent, and often unfair struggles of people trying to create order in a world where the rules were still being written. When most people picture women in the Wild West, 2 images usually come to mind: the seductive saloon girl draped over a bar stool, or the helpless damsel clinging to the hero's arm. But these stereotypes couldn't be further from the truth. The women of the American frontier were as tough, resourceful, and complex as the land itself. In fact, they were often the backbone of the West's survival. While men chased gold, herded cattle, or played outlaw, women were establishing real foundations for life on the frontier. Many were homesteaders, managing land, raising crops, and keeping families alive in brutal conditions. Under the Homestead Act of 1862, single women could file claims and own property outright, something nearly impossible in the East. These women chopped wood, built cabins, and braved isolation and danger with little more than determination and grit. Others became ranchers, school teachers, or business owners, often out of necessity. With so many men constantly on the move or killed by the hazards of frontier life, women stepped into roles society had previously denied them. They ran boarding houses, operated trading posts, opened general stores, and even became town mayors. In mining towns where male populations vastly outnumbered women, women had incredible leverage. They could demand respect, fair wages, and even political representation, long before many Eastern women had the vote. And then there were the women, who defied every norm altogether. Annie Oakley, born into poverty in Ohio, became one of the most skilled sharpshooters in American history. She joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and stunned audiences worldwide with her precision, charm, and poise, outshooting most of the men she shared the stage with. But Annie wasn't just a performer, she was an advocate for women's rights, and fiercely believed in women learning to defend themselves. Calamity Jane, another larger-than-life figure, blurred the lines between legend and reality. She wore men's clothes, drank heavily, swore like a soldier, and claimed to have fought alongside General Custer. While some of her stories were likely exaggerated or invented entirely, what's certain is that she carved out a space in a world that tried to keep women silent and submissive. She was a nurse, a scout, and a survivor, remembered as much for her wild spirit as for her resilience. But not all women on the frontier were white or famous. Indigenous women like Buffalo, Calf Road women of the Northern Cheyenne, played crucial roles as warriors, negotiators, and cultural keepers. During a time when their people were being forced off ancestral lands, these women resisted with strength and strategy, often leading their communities through times of crisis. Black women, too, helped shape the West, though their stories are often left out of mainstream history. Many came as freed people after the Civil War, seeking new beginnings. They homesteaded, worked as midwives and teachers, and built churches and schools in Black frontier towns like Nicodemus, Kansas. They carried the weight of both gender and racial discrimination, but still managed to claim their place in shaping the West's future. The real women of the Wild West were not background characters in a man's story. They were survivors, leaders, rebels, and builders. They defied expectations not for glory, but because survival demanded it. And by doing so, they redefined what womanhood could mean in a world that was still inventing itself. The portrayal of indigenous peoples in most classic Westerns is one of the most damaging myths ever created about the American frontier. Hollywood gave us the savage Indian stereotype, faceless warriors attacking wagon trains or circling cavalry posts, portrayed as obstacles to progress, rather than people with histories, families, and rights. But the reality is far more nuanced and far more tragic. Long before settlers arrived, the lands that would become the American West were home to countless indigenous nations, each with their own governments, economies, languages, and belief systems. From the Comanche and Apache in the Southwest to the Lakota and Cheyenne on the Great Plains, these societies had deep, sophisticated ties to their territories and ways of life. What Hollywood ignored, and what history often downplays, is that these people were not simply defeated by a superior force, they were resisting an invasion. The westward expansion after the Civil War wasn't just migration, it was occupation. The U.S. government signed dozens of treaties with native tribes promising land, sovereignty, and peace. Almost all of them were broken. Time and again, indigenous lands were seized when settlers or railroads pushed in, and when tribes resisted, the government responded with military campaigns and forced removals. This was a calculated strategy of displacement and control. Native people were rounded up and sent to reservations, often on land that was barren and far from their ancestral homes. The Dawes Act of 1887 divided communal land into individual plots in an effort to break up tribal identity and force assimilation. Children were taken from families and sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their language or practice their culture. The intent wasn't just to relocate Native peoples, it was to erase them. But indigenous communities didn't just disappear, they resisted. Leaders like Sitting Bull of the Hunkpapa Lakota fought to protect their lands and way of life. Sitting Bull played a central role in the defeat of General Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, a rare and powerful moment of victory in a brutal war of attrition. Yet even he would eventually be forced into surrender, and later killed by Indian police under orders from the U.S. government. Geronimo, a fierce Apache warrior, led decades of resistance against Mexican and American forces alike. Using guerrilla tactics and intimate knowledge of the desert terrain, he became a symbol of defiance. He was captured and escaped multiple times before finally surrendering in 1886. Though held as a prisoner of war for the rest of his life, he remained a legend to both native and non-native audiences. These were not aimless acts of violence. They were desperate defenses against extermination. While the mythology of the West painted indigenous people as aggressors, history tells us they were often reacting to broken promises, massacres, and land theft. The so-called Indian Wars weren't inevitable clashes of civilization. They were the violent consequences of expansion, greed, and a refusal to see native peoples as equals. And despite everything, indigenous communities endured. Their cultures, languages, and traditions have survived centuries of attempted erasure. Today, they continue to fight for sovereignty, environmental justice, and the protection of sacred lands. To understand the real story of the American West, we must start by listening to the voices that were silenced in its telling. Because the IEE frontier wasn't empty, and it wasn't lawless. It was a homeland. And for many, it still is. Life in the American West was anything but the romanticized adventure often shown in old Western films or childhood textbooks. While popular stories portray wide-open spaces, fresh opportunity, and self-made pioneers carving out a life with grit and determination, the reality was far more brutal and far more diverse. For many settlers, daily life meant constant struggle. Harsh weather, rough terrain, and isolation tested both body and mind. Winters could freeze livestock to death. Summers brought drought, dust storms, or wildfires. Disease spread quickly in small, unsanitary towns with little medical care. Hunger was a real and persistent threat, especially during crop failures or harsh seasons. Many families lived in sod homes, which offered some insulation, but also let in snakes, insects, and rainwater. Loneliness was another quiet killer, especially for women and children living miles from their nearest neighbor. The idea of the rugged pioneer building a life from nothing overlooks the hardship most faced. Settlers weren't just living the dream. They were often just trying to survive. The romantic image of manifest destiny masks the fact that many were fleeing economic hardship, discrimination, or even criminal pasts back east. But perhaps one of the most overlooked truths of frontier life is just how multicultural the West truly was. The West wasn't just settled by white Americans. It was built by a mosaic of peoples from around the world. Chinese immigrants played a critical role in constructing the Transcontinental Railroad. They endured grueling, dangerous conditions, were paid less than white workers, and were often scapegoated for economic troubles. Despite this, they built the most treacherous stretches of track through the Sierra Nevada mountains, work that made modern America possible. Black cowboys, often erased from history, made up an estimated 1 in 4 cowhands. Many were formerly enslaved or the children of freed people, and they found a level of respect on the range that they couldn't find in the South. Figures like Nat Love, a former slave-turned-rodeo legend, defied every stereotype about the American cowboy. Mexican vaqueros were actually the original cowboys. The word cowboy itself comes from their tradition. They were expert horsemen, cattle herders, and ranchers, long before the U.S. annexed parts of Mexico. Much of the cowboy gear we associate with the Wild West, lassos, spurs, wide-brimmed hats, comes directly from vaquero culture. Yet they too were marginalized, their land taken, and their legacy often claimed by others. And then there were the gold rush towns and boom towns that exploded overnight. Attracted by dreams of quick fortune, thousands poured into places like Deadwood, Tombstone, and Virginia City. But reality didn't match the hype. These towns were often lawless, overcrowded, and dangerous. Sanitation was poor, violence was common, and very few actually struck it rich. Most ended up broke, swindled, or working dangerous jobs in the mines. When the gold dried up, many of these towns were abandoned just as quickly as they appeared. Ghost towns left behind as monuments to ambition and desperation. Daily life in the West wasn't painted in sweeping cinematic glory. It was built on backbreaking labor, cultural exchange, and shared hardship. And if we look beyond the myths, we find stories of survival and resilience far more powerful than fiction ever allowed. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared something that would come to define an entire era. The American frontier was closed. The land that once seemed endless had been mapped, claimed, settled, and divided. Expansion had reached the Pacific. Native resistance had been crushed. Railroads now connected coast to coast. In the eyes of the government, the age of pioneers and gunfighters was officially over. But in many ways, that declaration was just the beginning of the myth, as the saw. Frontier faded from reality. It began to take on a new life in the American imagination. The chaos and hardship of the West became legend, romanticized and repackaged for a new era. And no force shaped this transformation more powerfully than Hollywood. By the early 20th century, Westerns had become one of the most popular genres in film. Cowboys rode across the silver screen with stoic resolve. Sheriffs stood tall against outlaws in dusty streets. Native Americans were reduced to one-dimensional enemies. The complexities of real frontier life were traded for a simplified story of good versus evil, civilization versus savagery. It was entertaining, it was thrilling, and it was myth. Figures like John Wayne became cultural icons, embodying a version of masculinity rooted in toughness, independence, and frontier justice. Western films didn't just reflect the past, they shaped how generations of Americans understood it. These stories reinforced ideas of American exceptionalism, rugged individualism, and moral clarity, values that would go on to influence everything from political rhetoric to national identity. But this cinematic West wasn't the real West. It left out the voices of women, people of color, immigrants, and indigenous peoples. It ignored the complexity, the injustice, and the diversity that defined the frontier. And yet, the legend persists, woven deep into the American psyche. The closing of the frontier didn't mark the end of the story, it marked the beginning of its mythologizing, a transformation from lived experience into national symbol, one that, to this day, continues to shape how America sees itself and how it tells its stories. The Wild West continues to capture our imagination. Gunfights at high noon, dusty duels, and lone cowboys riding into the sunset. But when we strip away the fiction, what we find is a far more complex and meaningful story. A story of survival, displacement, resilience, diversity, and contradiction. The myth persists because it's powerful, it's simple, and it speaks to deeply rooted ideas of freedom and identity. But the truth matters more. By clinging to a sanitized version of the past, we erase the people who lived it, the indigenous. Nations who fought for their land, the immigrants who built the railroads, the black cowboys who roamed the plains, and the women who defied expectations just to survive. The real West was not black and white, hero versus villain. It was messy, diverse, and full of shades we're still uncovering. History isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to remember. And the stories we tell about the past shape how we understand the present. So don't stop with the movies, dig deeper, read the memoirs, the letters, the hidden histories. The real West isn't less exciting, it's more. More human, more revealing, and more relevant than ever. Because understanding the truth doesn't just change how we see the past, it changes how we shape the future. Before you ride off into the sunset, we want to hear from you. Which Wild West myth surprised you the most? Was it the truth about the outlaw legends, the real role of women on the frontier, or how Hollywood twisted cowboy culture into something it never really was? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We're always reading and responding. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the myths and realities of the Wild West, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with fellow history buffs. It really helps the channel grow and keeps the stories coming. Next up, we're saddling up for Cowboys of Color, Forgotten Riders of the West, an untold chapter about the Black, Latino, and Native American cowboys who helped shape the frontier, but were nearly erased from the history books. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next trail.